Welcome, everyone, to the Weinberg Group webinar entitled ANDA versus 505(b)(2), When and Why. All participant lines will be in listen-only mode throughout the call. However, if you would like to submit a question or comment to the presenters, click the button marked Ask a Question on your event window and submit your question. All questions will be answered via email within a week of the presentation. To start, I would like to turn the conference over to Joel Falk. Mr. Falk, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our seminar. My name is Joel Falk from the Weinberg Group, and I will be moderating today's session entitled ANDA versus 505(b)(2), When and Why. The Weinberg Group is a regulatory and scientific consulting firm serving pharma, biotech, and device clients. We are based in Washington, D.C., with offices in San Francisco. Today's speaker is Dr. Nick Fleischer, who is a vice president of our clinical pharmacology and biopharmaceutics section here at the Weinberg Group. Dr. Fleischer has over 35 years of experience in biopharmaceutics, pharmacokinetics, pharmacy, and clinical pharmacology. His career before coming to the Weinberg Group around 15 years ago, his career included several positions at the U.S. FDA, the most recent of which was being director of the Division of Bioequivalence, Office of Generic Drugs, Center for the Drug Evaluation and Research, CDER. I would now like to turn the presentation over to Nick. Nick?
Thank you, Joel, and I'd also like to add my welcome to everybody for joining us on this webinar today. As the title of our presentation said, we will be discussing 505(b)(2)s versus ANDAs, and our discussion overview, as presented on the slide that you see, will encompass the definitions, will explain some of the nomenclature, the background that goes into what the 505(b)(2) process is, as well as an ANDA. We will talk about the process itself, how one goes about deciding which of these regulatory pathways one would choose and why one would choose that and what needs to be done in making the decision to go down one of these pathways. We'll also talk about the regulatory and legal issues that are involved in both of the pathways, as well as contrasting and comparing some of the exclusivities that one could get with using either a 505(b)(2) NDA pathway versus the ANDA pathway. Then we'll also talk a little bit about the required data for both of those applications, and we'll end up with a comparison of the costs that may be involved in deciding on which of these pathways one would decide to use in getting regulatory approval from the FDA. So one would have to consider that there are basically three submission options. I mean, there also is the OTC monograph route for getting drugs marketed, but we're going to exclude discussions about that totally today because those are not a pre-approval option, because once somebody meets the monograph conditions, they can go to market with a product. So we're going to have our discussion basically relate to the three regulatory pathways that are listed here on the slide. The 505(b)(1), which is also known as a full NDA that everybody's familiar with, that needs the non-clinical safety tox studies, that ordinarily we need clinical studies, which include clinical pharmacology studies, the CMC, the chemistry manufacturing control section. So that would be the full 505(b)(1) NDA that we usually think about. The 505(b)(2) is somewhat of a hybrid NDA in between a 505(b)(1) and an ANDA, an abbreviated new drug application, where some of these requirements that I just listed, and I will talk about those later, may not be required. And 505J is an ANDA, an abbreviated new drug application. And what these numbers and these letters refer to are exactly sections out of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that actually describes what these submission types of applications are. So, as I said earlier, the NDA, a 505(b)(1) NDA is what is considered as a full NDA. and as described in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, it provides for the submission of a new drug application to support the approval of a drug. What that means in layman's terms basically is that when somebody wants to market a drug, they have to submit the information to the FDA and obtain approval from the FDA prior to marketing, and that is a full new drug application. Ordinarily, a full NDA is used in most cases for new chemical entities, and it does require complete reporting of the non-clinical pharmacology, toxicology information. It will require clinical pharmacology information, clinical investigations that prove the safety and efficacy of the product that is being considered in the application, as well as the chemistry manufacturing controls that will document that the product can be made to meet certain quality standards that the FDA would require. In most cases, these studies would be conducted by the innovator, or they would certainly pay somebody to do the studies for them. But the big difference here is that for a 505b1 NDA, there is no reliance or very minimal reliance on other work that, as opposed to 505b2, where you would have no right of reference to work. So in a 505b1 NDA, the information is actually information that is owned by the applicant, as the applicant is the one that is generating that data, and they have all the rights to that data. There is an exception to a 505b1 that may not contain all these parts that I've listed on this slide, and that situation is when a 505b1 applicant wants to submit a somewhat modified application. By that I mean, let's say, a modified dosage form or some change from their original application. But instead of having to repeat all of the studies that they may have done for their original application, they can actually reference the FDA to go to their original NDA and to utilize some of the information that would pertain to their new application, and by that they have referenced that information and wouldn't have to repeat it. Now, this is different from a 505b2 because that the applicant here in a 505b1 actually have the right of reference to the original information that they generated and have access to use that and have the FDA refer to that for the new application, which will not contain all of that information. So just to give you a quick example of that, so in case a 505b1 applicant wants to make a modification and file a new 505b1 NDA, but they don't want to repeat all the non-clinical pharm tox data, they could then refer the FDA to the original NDA and not have to repeat that in the new NDA. And that would still be a 505b1, even though it would not contain any of the pharm tox data that ordinarily would be required in a B1 NDA. But jumping right into what an ANDA is, the acronym stands for Abbreviated New Drug Application, and what an ANDA is, it's a type of new drug application in which approval of a generic drug is based on demonstrating that it is comparable to the innovator drug product, also known as the reference listed drug. And you need to be very cognizant of those initials, RLD, because that is what is the basis of an ANDA application. It is comparing yourself, if you are an ANDA applicant, to the innovator product, being the RLD. Now, I did use the word comparable in that definition, but I want to differentiate that from being identical, because in many cases, in fact in most cases, ANDAs are not identical, they're only comparable to the innovator drug product. We use the term abbreviated because they generally do not include preclinical and clinical data to establish safety and efficacy of the ANDA application. Instead, what the generic applicant has to do for an ANDA, they need to demonstrate that their product is bioequivalent, and by bioequivalent we mean that it performs in the same manner and is comparable to the innovator product in active ingredient, in dosage form, strength, route of administration, labeling, quality, performance characteristics, and intended use. What the 1984 Drug Price Competition and Restoration Act, or as commonly known, depending on which side of the aisle you sit, either the Hatch-Waxman Act or the Waxman-Hatch Act, gives the right of an ANDA applicant to rely on the innovator's data for safety and efficacy. And that is why an abbreviated new drug application has to identify an RLD, but then is not required to perform any of the safety or efficacy information that would be required for a new drug application. The key element of an ANDA is two basic terminologies that one has to remember. The first one being that the ANDA needs to be pharmaceutically equivalent. Now, in a couple of minutes, I will talk about another ANDA type of application, which doesn't have to be, but I think at this point, it's important to remember that an ANDA, an ANDA product, has to be pharmaceutically equivalent, which means it has to be identical to, and identical, again, has a different definition than totally identical, and the only reason I say that is because some of the inactive ingredients in some formulations, some dosage forms, sometimes have to be identical to the innovator. In other dosage forms, they do not have to be identical to the innovator. So the one key element, as I said, is the pharmaceutical equivalence, and the second key element is bioequivalence. So as long as those two key elements of an ANDA are met, that is what is required for submission of an ANDA. Now, as I said earlier, the abbreviated new drug applications are covered under 505J of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And for those people who enjoy reading regulations, you can refer to the Code of Federal Regulations in 314.92, which describes more fully what the requirements that the FDA needs to see in an ANDA submission. Just to summarize quickly here on this slide, an abbreviated application could be submitted for drug products that are same as the listed drug or as the same as the reference listed drug. They have to be identical in their active ingredients. They have to be identical in their dosage form, in their strength, in their route of administration, and identical in the conditions of use, except for when there are uses or indications that are protected by exclusivity. However, that doesn't preclude an ANDA applicant from filing an application, even though there may be some indications that are protected by exclusivity. In those cases, the FDA can carve out that section of the labeling. As long as it doesn't affect the safe use of the product, the FDA can approve a product with the less than the full indications that may be in the innovator product for the indications that may be protected by exclusivity. And the next area of an ANDA that I'll talk about in a minute, which I kind of alluded to a minute ago, was about non-pharmaceutically equivalent, and those would be products that are based on what's called a suitability petition, where a suitability petition is filed with the agency and asking them permission to file an ANDA that is slightly different than the listed drug, basically one that would not meet the true definition of pharmaceutical equivalence. Again, the pertinent section of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is 505J2C, which talks about the filing of a suitability petition, and the regulations that talk about the filing is in the 314.93. This type of ANDA can be used for several type of changes that are permitted as described in these regulations. One of them is a change in a combination product where an ANDA applicant can change the active pharmaceutical ingredient, the API, as long as it's the same pharmacologic or therapeutic class as the reference listed drug. A quick example would be a combination product of say like an aspirin and a codeine product, where the petition could be filed to change from aspirin to acetaminophen, and hopefully have the FDA approve that as a equal pharmacologic therapeutic class drug, and the combination could be filed as a suitability petition and still go through the ANDA process and not have to go through an NDA process. The product would have to have the same therapeutic effect as the RLD for the indications that are desired, so basically the labeling would have to be not significantly different from the RLD label. One of the things that's very important in ANDA is that the RLD has not been discontinued for safety reasons. So in a situation where an applicant wants to file an ANDA that is no longer listed in the Orange Book, at least in the front section of the Orange Book, they would have to file a petition to ascertain whether the product that is now in the discontinued section of the Orange Book has been discontinued for safety reasons, and the FDA will make a determination whether it has or not, and if the determination is that it was not removed for safety reasons, then the ANDA applicant can rely on that and use that as an RLD and file a new ANDA for that product. a little more discussion about the suitability petition route, and the reason that I'm spending a little bit of time on the suitability petition because later on when I talk about the 505B2, you will see that some of the things that the suitability petition are utilized for are nearly identical to what the 505B2 application could be utilized for. So there's a lot of overlap, and this is where, as I said in my introductory comments, people can make the decision on several factors on which would be the optimal pathway for them to go down, whether to file a suitability petition and go through the ANDA process, or to file the product as a 505B2, even though the products would be identical as far as the final outcome. So some of the reasons why somebody would want to file a suitability petition would be to potentially change a dosage form. For example, if the RLD, the innovator product, was a tablet, but it was felt that a capsule dosage form of identical strength of the identical active ingredient would be a viable marketing opportunity, somebody could certainly file a petition with the agency and ask the agency to make a determination whether a capsule of that same product can be filed as an ANDA and go through the ANDA process. Sometimes a petition could be filed for a change in a route of administration. Many times we see petitions filed for changes in strength. Most often it's changes in strength that are intermediate to the strengths that the RLD is available in. For example, if the RLD is available in a 500 and 1,000 milligram dosage form, and there's a need out there for a 750 milligram dosage form, since the labeling will encompass that, it's very viable to file a suitability petition and ask the FDA if an intermediate strength could be filed through the ANDA process. As I said earlier, another suitability petition, that possibility is to substitute one active ingredient for another of the same pharmacologic class in an existing combination drug product. One of the drawbacks of the suitability petition is that it is a public document, as all petitions are. They do get submitted onto the docket, and basically everybody that has access to the docket will know that somebody has petitioned the agency for the possibility of filing an ANDA for a changed formulation. That is the reason why many applicants that want to protect their confidentiality will use a third party to file their suitability petitions. The only problem with that is that once the suitability petition is approved by the agency, well, first of all, as I said earlier, everybody knows that the petition is out there. So if everybody else was thinking about doing something like that now, it basically opens up the floodgates to anybody else that wants to go down that road. But the main detriment in the petition process is that once the petition is approved by the agency, anybody can basically use that petition as a justification for filing their ANDA. So as I said, if the petition is out there, it's not just the applicant that has a right to use that petition as a justification, but anybody can use that justification and file their ANDA with the agency and say, based on this petition, I'm filing my ANDA, which is different from the references to drug, and here's the information to support my change, etc. The FDA must approve the petition and accept the product as an ANDA unless they determine that the change that is being proposed would require safety and efficacy trials. And that is the only reason why a petition can be turned down. And we do see a lot of petitions that are turned down when FDA makes its determination that they feel that a bioequivalence study alone would not be sufficient to say that this changed ANDA, that this is the subject of a petition, would be approvable based on bioequivalence studies only. So in those situations, FDA will turn down a petition and will explain that the reason they're turning it down because they feel that clinical trials would be required to demonstrate the safety and efficacy of this changed product, and therefore it no longer makes it eligible for the ANDA process. This is interesting to note because if somebody is actually considering the option of whether going down the ANDA route versus the 505B2 NDA route, and there is this concern of what would the FDA require if the 505B2 NDA versus the ANDA is something that potentially could be approved through a bioequivalence trial, but one is certainly not 100% sure that FDA may require clinical trials. If you file a petition and the petition response comes back that clinical trials are needed, well, it certainly gives you the answer what the 505b2 NDA pathway should be. And in retrospect also, it would tell you that for a 505b2 NDA, what you would potentially need to do, that bioequivalence would not be adequate to support that application. So going on into the 505b2. Now, a 505b2 is considered to be a full NDA as it is a 505b application, B being the section, again, of the Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, and just the differentiation between the one as a full NDA and two being the 505b2 NDA. As I was just alluding to, years ago, before the formalization of the 505b2 NDA through the Hatch-Waxman Act, many people may remember there was NDAs that used to be known as the paper NDAs, and what the Hatch-Waxman Act did is actually formalize for the FDA and for everybody else the paper NDA process and put it into regulations to what would be required in a B2 NDA. The reporting requirements would be any previously reported safety and efficacy data, information from studies that were not conducted by the applicant, and done by having the FDA rely on its prior conclusions on safety and efficacy from other NDAs or from literature. And as I mentioned earlier, the big difference between the 505b1 NDA and the B2 NDA is that in a B2 NDA, the applicant lacks the right of reference to the information that would be needed to support that NDA. Now, if there are some changes in the NDA, for example, one of the things that I will be discussing as examples of a 505b2 NDA is a new indication. If a sponsor feels that they can develop a product with a new indication, then that specific indication would require clinical studies. However, as I mentioned earlier, some of the information, for example, preclinical tox, safety and tox information, can be relied on because that may be applicable to the new 505b2 NDA and would not have to be repeated. However, for a new clinical indication, there would be requirement for new clinical trials to support that indication. It's important to note here a difference that occasionally pops up in people's understanding about an LD versus an RLD, the listed drug versus the reference listed drug. For an ANDA, there really is no alternative other than to rely on the FDA's identified reference listed drug. This is identified in the Orange Book, where the FDA actually has a column where it'll say this is the reference listed drug, and the reason that FDA does that is that all ANDA applicants will have to rely on the same reference listed drug for that product in obtaining approval of their ANDA. However, for a 505b2, there is no such requirement that you have to rely on the RLD, the reference listed drug that is identified by the FDA. According to the regulations, the regulations state listed drug, which means any drug that has been approved by the FDA for safety and efficacy. However, we are seeing a little bit of a transition from that lately, which at least the FDA is starting to put into writing, and I will get to that later in my talk. Now, as you will notice on this list, on the slide that I have up on the screen right now, the products that are allowed under 505b2, some of these changes are very similar to what I listed earlier for changes that are permitted under a suitability petition. So some of the changes on a 505b2 would be a dosage regimen, an API change. This is something that definitely would not be allowed in either a petition or an ANDA. So if you actually were to change the API by a different salt, ester, complex, chelate, then racemate or enantiomer, there was no way you could actually file that either through a petition or through as an ANDA. That would only go through as a 505b2 NDA. Obviously, a new indication could not be included in an ANDA, but could be part of a 505b2. A proposal to switch from an RX to an OTC could be a 505b2 application. And there are certain situations where a product, a formulation that may have been thought to go through an ANDA process, but after you do some pilot studies, it turns out they're bioinequivalent. That could potentially be use the 505(b)(2) pathway. However, it can't be used when the bioavailability is inferior. So if you do a bioequivalence study, and it turns out that the proposed ANDA is less bioavailable than the RLD, that would not be acceptable as a 505(b)(2) NDA. However, the other way, if it was more bioavailable, certainly it would be something that would be amenable for discussion with the FDA to file that product as a 505(b)(2) NDA. One of the other most often used 505(b)(2) NDAs that we've seen is formulation changes that are outside the 505J limits. Many of the 505J, the ANDAs, utilize the FDA's inactive ingredient guide, the IIG, for a good understanding of the amounts of excipients that may be utilized. However, sometimes a sponsor may want to use an excipient outside of that range. So while that may not fall under acceptability as an ANDA, because it would require additional safety information to justify the use of that inactive ingredient outside the range, that is a possibility to go down the 505(b)(2) NDA route. Also, if a new excipient that is not on the IIG at all, that has never been qualified, accepted by the FDA previously, and found to be safe as an inactive ingredient in a drug product, for that route, the pathway to use would be to go down the 505(b)(2) NDA pathway and submit the required information to justify the use of that excipient. One of the things that is very important in remembering about the 505(b)(2) NDA that occasionally people get tripped up in is that it cannot be used for a product that is fully eligible for an ANDA. Now, certainly there are nuances. As I said earlier, a product that would be an ANDA that is identical or very comparable to a reference-listed drug, but let's say just uses a different excipient or an excipient that's outside the range. Theoretically, that should be one that should be an ANDA, but because it has that difference, it cannot be an ANDA. But if it is identical and falls under all the requirements that would justify filing that product as an ANDA, then it cannot be filed as a 505(b)(2) NDA, and the FDA, in most cases, should refuse to accept that application as a 505(b)(2) ANDA. So with some of the issues that are associated with the 505(b)(2) NDA are some of the products that are covered by a 505J cannot be filed as a 505(b)(2) NDA. As I said earlier, if it can fall under the ANDA rules, it needs to be filed as an ANDA. Other than, of course, something that would have to be a petition, and this is what I mentioned earlier, that there is the opportunity for people to choose whether they want to file a suitability petition for a change or to use the 505(b)(2) NDA pathway. So just because a product could be filed as a petition, that does not preclude somebody from filing that changed application through the 505(b)(2) NDA pathway. The only time that you cannot use the 505(b)(2) NDA pathway is when the product would be identical to an ANDA product. The other places where 505(b)(2) can't be used is where the only difference is in the extent, so the exposure of the active ingredient, and absorbed less than the RLD. And this is what I was saying earlier, that if you're bioinequivalent but on the low side, that's a situation where the 505(b)(2) NDA process cannot be used at all. Now, there is a possibility of using the 505(b)(2) NDA pathway where you don't demonstrate bioequivalence for both rate and extent. However, if the rate is an unintentional rate, so if you fail the Cmax in a bioequivalence trial, but it's unintentional, it just happened to work out that way, then that product cannot be filed as a 505(b)(2). However, there certainly are situations where a difference in the rate is intentional. For example, in an extended release formulation, where you can match the extent or the exposure measured by area under the curve, but the Cmax is obviously different because now you've got a prolonged or extended release formulation, and you're not going to have as high a peak as an immediate release product. In that situation, if it's intentional, and there's other descriptions in the Code of Federal Regulations that describe what those differences are, in those situations, a 505(b)(2) NDA could be possible. Now, the purpose of the 505(b)(2), as I said earlier, the foundation of it was the original paper NDA process, but basically what it was designed for was to encourage innovation without creating duplicate work. And basically, it envisions the same principle as the 505J application, the ANDA process, which was designed that you shouldn't have to repeat all the safety and efficacy trials that the innovator company did, if you can make sure that you're comparable to the innovator product. So the concept was that it would be wasteful and unnecessary to carry out studies to demonstrate what is already known about a drug. And that's the underlying principle of the 505(b)(2) as well as the 505J, the ANDA pathway. In most cases, though, the 505(b)(2) process will not yield an AB rated drug. So it will not be a fully substitutable drug product as is the outcome of an ANDA. The ANDAs nowadays, post-1984, any ANDA that is approved can only be approved that it can get an AB rating or an A rating to the innovator product and be recognized as fully substitutable for that product. However, a 505(b)(2) NDA does not, in most cases, does not get an A rating. In most cases, if it does meet the pharmaceutical equivalence criteria, could potentially just get a B rating. But in most cases, since the 505(b)(2s, and I will list examples later, are so different that they just couldn't even be listed as the same line item in the Orange Book. However, there are some examples where 505(b)(2) NDAs have gotten AB ratings, and I'm sure there must be a list around somewhere. I'm going to just give you a couple examples that I'm aware of very quickly. Levothyroxine tablets. All the levothyroxines, or most of them anyway, have been approved through a 505(b)(2) NDA pathway, and many of them have AB ratings and are substitutable for each other. An injectable product, nicardipine injection, was approved several years ago by the FDA through a 505(b)(2) NDA pathway. And in that situation, the product didn't actually get an AB rating because it was an injectable parenteral product, but it got an AP rating. So it did get that A first letter rating, which meant it was fully substitutable for the innovative product that it was relying on as a listed drug. And another example in another dosage form, and the reason I'm giving you these three different dosage forms is just to see the variety of products that can get an A rating, is tretinoin cream that was actually found to be AB rated, but went through a 505(b)(2) pathway in getting its approval. So here are some 505(b)(2) NDA examples that are possible and have been done. Some dosage form changes. Certainly one could take an oral product and go to a transdermal product, or any other route for that matter. A change from an immediate release product to an extended release product is possible through the 505(b)(2) NDA. And for a topical product, if the innovator product's a lotion product, somebody could develop a foam formulation of that product and use the 505(b)(2) NDA pathway to get approval of that. Again, in dosage strength, while this is something that I mentioned through the suitability petition pathway, is also possible through a 505(b)(2) NDA pathway. However, with a petition, the FDA could certainly turn down a petition if the dosage strength is outside of the labeled claims of the innovator product, and FDA determines that the change on that dose would require safety and or efficacy trials for that change. It would be turned down. For a 505(b)(2) NDA, it can be done, but again, if the response for a similar change was that a clinical trial would be required, it's pretty certain that for a 505(b)(2) NDA, the FDA would require clinical trials for extension of either a lower or higher strength. A dosage regimen change is also something that could be done under a 505(b)(2) NDA. And for example, going from an innovator or listed drug that is twice daily dosage to a once daily dosage. But again, clinical trials would most likely be required to have such a change made. Some other 505(b)(2) examples, an intravenous formulation to some other parenteral routes, intramuscular, subcutaneous, so that could be done as a 505(b)(2). As I was mentioning earlier about a 505(b)(1) application, certainly this could be done if the innovator product was a 505(b)(1) and was intravenous and they wanted to change their product, whereas potentially it could go through as a supplement to the NDA. The FDA may also require that it be a brand new NDA because of this new route of administration. But in that situation, if it's the innovator doing it, they would still file it as a 505(b)(1) and not a 505(b)(2) because they would have right of reference to all the information in their original application. An active ingredient change, as I said earlier, changing the API, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, to change the salt, racemate, or enantiomer would be a possibility. And 505(b)(2) NDA would also be possible for a new molecular entity, an NME. So if there's an approved drug and the approved drug, there's a prodrug of the approved drug that's out there, the listed drug, the prodrug would be an NME and would have to be filed as a 505(b)(2) NDA and may not require all the studies that would a 505(b)(1) NDA would require. And the active metabolite of an approved drug. Again, if the approved drug is out there and we know that there's an active metabolite, somebody could file a 505(b)(2) NDA for that metabolite. New combinations, combining previously approved products that have been approved individually and putting them together is a possibility for using a 505(b)(2) NDA. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the examples where an ANDA would be impossible is when you use excipients that would not be allowed under 505J. That's where the 505(b)(2) NDA would come into play as a viable regulatory strategy for filing such a product. Now, as I said earlier, we're going to talk a little bit about the exclusivity issues that are available for these two pathways. With an ANDA pathway, the only time you actually get exclusivity if you're the first to file with a paragraph 4 certification, and then you can get 180 days of exclusivity where the FDA will not approve another ANDA until that exclusivity period is up. Patent protection for an ANDA is possible. However, those patents are not listed in the Orange Book. It'd just be a patent as any other patent that would be out there in the patent world, where if you had a unique formulation that you wanted to patent, and a second ANDA applicant came along and it was thought that their formulation somehow infringed the first patent, then it would definitely be a patent infringement, but certainly outside of the FDA realms of what we know of as patent litigation as relates to ANDA applications. A 505(b)(2) NDA can get exclusivity, a 3-year exclusivity, only when the approvability of that NDA required clinical data. So in a situation where a 505(b)(2) NDA goes for, let's say, a new indication, and they need clinical trials to get that new indication approved, the FDA would give that application 3 years of exclusivity. If they develop a new formulation and clinical trials are required to get that new formulation approved, other than pharmacokinetic bioequivalence trials, that would also grant 3 years of exclusivity, which means that the FDA could not approve a generic version of that 505(b)(2) NDA until those 3 years are up. And there is patent protection that can be given to a 505(b)(2) NDA that will be listed in the Orange Book. The data requirements are fairly similar between the two application pathways as far as chemistry, manufacturing, controls information. As far as the analytical and the manufacturing information would be the same for both. Now, at the present time, there is a difference in the stability requirements between an ANDA and a 505(b)(2) NDA. At the present time, an ANDA submits their application with 3 months of real-time data on one batch and 3 months of accelerated data, and for that, they can get a 2-year expiration date. As we heard recently at a recent meeting, the FDA is about to change that. which I'm sure the generic companies are not going to be very happy with, but they are going to bring that more into line with what the ANDA requirements are, which I've stated below, which is 12 months of real time on 3 batches with 6 months of accelerated data. Now, the only difference that I'm aware of is that for ANDA, what is being proposed at least, and this could change, but the stability requirements will be similar to ICH-Q1A, which means it'll be 12 months. However, instead of requiring on 3 batches as would be required for an ANDA, it will be based on 2 pilot and 1 smaller batches for the stability information. But it's my understanding at the present time that FDA is still accepting the applications with 3 months of the accelerated and 3 months of real time. Safety information is not required for the ANDA at submission. However, safety updates would be required periodically, annual reports, and certainly if more serious adverse events were reported for back to the ANDA holder, probably prior to an annual report. For a 505(b)(2) NDA submission, safety information would be part of the submission. As far as the other required data, efficacy, certainly it's not required for an ANDA. It would be required for 505(b)(2) NDA if it's a new indication, something that could not be approved based on bioequivalence. And I do want to point out, which I may have overlooked earlier, that there are several 505(b)(2) NDAs that actually have relied strictly on bioequivalence as the only basis for approval. So that is a pathway, but the pathway, ordinarily one would think of an NDA as requiring clinical trials. It can be very similar to an ANDA, an ANDA, and rely on a bioequivalence study to obtain approval. Patent certification is required for both ANDAs and for 505(b)(2) if the references to drug or the listed drug in the 505(b)(2) NDA case has patents associated with it. As far as pharmacokinetic data, in an ANDA, it's a minimum of a single-dose fasted bioequivalence trial. Now, this is assuming that pharmacokinetics or blood level studies are amenable. If not, and there is other pathways like a clinical endpoint bioequivalence trial, that would be the requirement. But for pharmacokinetic purposes, it would be a single-dose fasted bioequivalence trial. Most cases, also a single-dose fed bioequivalence trial, but there are certain situations where FDA does not require a food effect study for an ANDA. For a 505(b)(2) NDA, definitely you need a single-dose bioequivalence trial comparing to the listed drug, and that would be sometimes called a bridging study. You most often would need a single-dose food effect trial, and in many cases you would also need a multiple-dose steady-state study. And for a modified release, I think it would always be required for a 505(b)(2) ANDA. The labeling for an ANDA would be identical to the references to drug. There are certain exceptions that are listed in the regulations that would be different, things like manufacturing site, other minor differences that allow it to be different, but for the most part they would be identical. The other thing, as I mentioned earlier, the exclusive indications, the ones that are protected by exclusivity of the RLD, could not be included in the labeling of the ANDA until such time that the exclusivity period expires, at which time the ANDA applicant could then change and update their labeling to include the previously excluded part of the label. For 505(b)(2) NDA, it may be similar to the, and I have references to drug here, it's really listed drug is the appropriate term, but it should be similar or can be similar, but there are differences that would be based on how different the 505(b)(2) NDA would be from the listed drug. And I said some of the indications may be totally different from the listed drug, but then again, that would be based on the clinical trials that would be conducted to support that 505(b)(2) NDA. Now, in this slide, I've listed, for summary purposes, an overall comparison of the 3 pathways. The formulating the product, in each case, you'd be identical. The preclinical tox information For 505B1, as I mentioned earlier, definitely required. For 505B2, may be required. And for an ANDA, definitely not required. The manufacturing stability and control information, the CMC, would be identical for all three pathways. This is a critical point, the FDA meeting. One of the things that is very important is to get feedback on your submission strategy. Whereas with an ANDA, there really is no mechanism in place for a pre-meeting with the FDA. And there's good explanation for that because it's fairly straightforward. As long as you follow the regulations and you copy the innovator product as much as you can, it's fairly clearly spelled out what the requirements would be, so there really is no reason to meet with the FDA and obtain their feedback. However, with a 505B2 and a 505B1, it definitely would be good to have a pre-IND meeting to lay out the plans of what the submission strategy would be and get the FDA buy-in. The pharmacokinetic study, as I mentioned earlier, has similarities and some dissimilarities about how many studies would be required between the three pathways. The clinical trials, as I said earlier, a B1 almost always, except, of course, one that has a right of reference, but a B1 most likely will always have a clinical trial associated with it. A B2 sometimes, and an ANDA, other than a clinical endpoint bioequivalence trial, will not have any clinical trials. Again, for having an FDA meeting for a pre-NDA, again, it's a good idea to have it with a B2 also, definitely with a B1. And as I said earlier, I mean, it's critical to vet the strategy of the studies that would be needed to support the application and get the FDA buy-in before progressing down the road of putting an application together and thinking that you have it right and then finding out later that the FDA had different opinions about that. One of the things that certainly in a pre-IND meeting with a 505B2, one would want to definitely make sure of is that you choose the appropriate listed drug. As I said earlier, for an ANDA, it's spelled out in the Orange Book. The FDA designates which is the RLD, and so you can't make a mistake there, hopefully. However, with a 505B2 NDA, since the language of the regulation says listed drug, it's really any approved product that is in the Orange Book as an approved product. However, we are seeing situations where sponsors are running into problems by picking the wrong listed drug and finding out later, if they haven't met with the FDA and obtained buy-in from the FDA, of then having the FDA come back and tell them that they picked the wrong listed drug and they have to use an alternate listed drug to support their 505B2 NDA. The submission, obviously putting the application together is very similar in all three situations. Obviously, the volume would be different, but as far as what goes into it, pretty much the same. User fees for B1 definitely, for B2 most likely there will be user fees, and at least for the present time, we still don't have user fees for ANDAs. However, that may be changing shortly also. Exclusivity, as I mentioned earlier, for the ANDA is only the paragraph 4. If you're first to file, you can get that 180-day exclusivity, and that's the only exclusivity. For a 505B2, it's possible, if clinical trials are required for approval of that 505B2, to get a 3-year exclusivity. And then for a 505B1, in most cases, you do get some exclusivity protection. Now, for comparative timing and costs on this slide, and these monetary figures are not exact figures. They're just put in there for comparative purposes on what one would expect as getting the application through the process. So for an ANDA where you're only doing bioequivalence trials, it could be a short time, 4 to 6 months, to get those done, and the costs are there on the slide. The submission time to get the submission in could be anywhere from 1 to 2 months. And the biggest thing is that because right now there are no user fees in the generic drug world, there is no timeline for when the FDA must take action on an application. And the slide says 18 plus months. We're hearing 24 to 30 months. So it's It's just a long time, an unknown long time for how long an ANDA will get approved. Whereas for a 505(b)(2) NDA, the clinical trials, obviously, if they're needed, can be 12 to 24 months, and you see the estimated costs that are associated with those. The bioequivalence studies would be very similar to the ANDA. Submission time could be very similar to the ANDA. And the big difference being that the 505(b)(2) NDA goes through the PDUFA, the user fee process. FDA must take an action on an application within 10 months to either approve or not approve the product. So there is a known process. So in conclusion, I just want to wrap up quickly here that the 505(b)(2) NDA pathway is a low-risk pathway. And the reason I say it's a low-risk pathway is because of the opportunity to interact with the FDA all along the process and get feedback. And it's not like submitting your application as an ANDA and just waiting to hear, getting your deficiency letters back and resubmitting an amendment and waiting again and taking a long time and not having the opportunity to dialogue with the FDA along the way. As I said, you can get early feedback from the FDA. That pre-IND meeting with the FDA is critical for somebody that's going down a 505(b)(2) pathway. And while most cases people are looking for AB-rated products, at least that's the model for the ANDA world, in the 505(b)(2) NDA world, while it may be useful, it's not critical as long as you have the marketing capability and enough of a differentiation of your product to make it a unique product that prescribers will prescribe the product and it will be used. So with that, I will turn it back to Mr. Falk, Joel Falk, for the Q&A.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Nick. That was, chock full of very good information. We have quite a number of questions from our participants. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through all of these right now. I would tell you two things. One is that many of the questions were about the availability of the slides, and they will be made available to you within the next week, so everyone will have these. And the other is, if we don't get to your question, they too will be answered as soon as possible, and you'll receive an email with those answers. So, Nick, there are a number of questions that we have here that range from regulatory in nature to bioequivalence, some on clinical studies. Let me just see if I can pick out a couple. We're running late. But let me ask you, the first question that I have here is, can either the ANDA route or the 505J2C suitability petition route be pursued to allow the use of a different salt of the API than used in the reference listed drug?
That's an excellent question, but I think it's a fairly easy answer to that one, that it can't. I mean, the FDA's policy is that, at least this time, that the ANDA cannot be used for a different salt because that would be considered as a different API, and the suitability petition would not be amenable for such a change. It's not listed as such a change. So the agency would not approve a suitability petition that was asking to change the API from one salt to another salt, and that in that scenario, then one must either utilize the 505(b)(1) pathway or the 505(b)(2) NDA pathway. Okay,
great, thanks. I have another question here. This is an interesting question and fairly specific, I think. If you develop an orally disintegrating tablet formulation that's bioequivalent to an approved immediate release tablet, what exactly might the regulatory pathway be?
This is one of those situations where, as I said during my talk, people have the option to choose different pathways. Certainly, this would be something that could be amenable to utilizing the ANDA suitability petition pathway, because this is a change in dosage form from a tablet to an orally disintegrating tablet. And as I said, this is a change that is recognized as an applicable change by the FDA. In this situation, the FDA could only deny the suitability petition if they felt that clinical investigations were needed to approve the safety and efficacy of the orally disintegrating product. Now, if that does occur, if the petition response comes back and they say we cannot approve this change, it cannot be filed as an ANDA because clinical trials would be required, then you could certainly go and utilize the 505(b)(2) pathway. However, there is precedent for this because there have been other formulate products that have been approved through this pathway where companies have utilized a suitability petition and got it approved and then filed an ANDA for getting that changed formulation from a innovator RLD of a tablet to an ODT as an ANDA.
Okay, great. Here's a question about using, actually, probably it looks more like an ANDA, but it's an interesting question also. If you're using a new excipient for a generic formulation, is that going to be an ANDA or is that going to be a 505(b)(2)?
This is another interesting question, and we've seen situations where it becomes somewhat of a problem for an ANDA applicant in getting through the ANDA process, even to the point of getting the application filed. Because what happens is that the Office of Generic Drugs will do a filing review, and if they pick up on something such as this, they may not even accept the ANDA even before it gets to the review process, which is probably better than finding out about it later on. But as I said, it depends on the formulation that's involved. If it's a solid oral dosage form, then an acceptable inactive can be used and still file it as an ANDA. As I said in my talk, the list that people refer to is the IIG, the Inactive Ingredient Guide. However, it depends on the dosage form because, as I said earlier, different dosage forms, for example, parenterals have to be identical, except, of course, for exception ingredients, which are listed in the regulations. For ophthalmics and otics, again, there are different rules. For topicals, there are different rules. So there certainly is a variety of potential answers depending on the route of the administration of the ANDA that is being considered. Typically, the Office of Generic Drugs will not approve a formulation using inactives that do not meet Section 314.94, which describes what needs to be in an ANDA. If the applicant needs to use an inactive that is not allowed under the Inactive Ingredient Guide or not consistent with 314.94, then in those situations, the 505(b)(2) route is possible. What the FDA may require to support approval may vary case by case. They may require full clinical tox studies to characterize the excipient, or they may rely on literature. That, as I said, it's a case-by-case situation. This is a situation where it's probably very good to try to get early discussions with the agency when a novel excipient is being considered.
Okay. When would it be better to file a 505(b)(2) as opposed to a supplemental NDA for your own product that you want to make a change to?
Yeah, this is a question that comes up quite often. The real answer to this is that if you were the 505(b)(1) NDA holder, you should not be filing a 505(b)(2). And the reason for that is because you have the right of reference to all the information that would be needed in this supposed supplemental NDA or new NDA, because you generated that, you own that, and it is yours. And the 505(b)(2) regulations specifically state that the 505(b)(2) NDA pathway is for situations where you do not have the right of reference to the information that's needed to support your application. So my suggestion in a situation like this would be to use to file a 505(b)(1) NDA, a new 505(b)(1) NDA, and reference all of the information that is pertinent to supporting this new 505(b)(1) NDA back to the original 505(b)(1) NDA.
Okay. I think we're really at the 1 hour point. Let me just ask. Let's get one more question in here. What dosage forms would yield an AB rating in a 505(b)(2) application? I know we've been asked that before, but that would be an interesting thing to talk about.
It's a constant question that comes up, and that's why I touched upon it very briefly during my presentation, that there are some examples. So while ordinarily one would think that a 505(b)(2) NDA may not be amenable to get an AB rating, because it is an NDA and not an ANDA, which ANDAs are usually the ones that get the AB rating. But it is, as I said, and if I give examples, it is possible. But it's very difficult to generalize which dosage form would get that. Probably the most likely scenario of getting a 505(b)(2) NDA and getting an AB rating is one of the examples that I gave, where because you use novel excipients or excipients that are outside of the ranges that would be permissible under the IIG, and that basically made the application be a 505(b)(2) NDA. However, everything else would be identical. In a situation like that, I think one would easily be able to justify asking the FDA, and this is a big issue with a 505(b)(2) NDA, whereas with an ANDA, that getting that AB rating is an automatic thing. Once the product is approved, it gets in the Orange Book with that AB rating. With a 505(b)(2) NDA, because it's reviewed by the new drug staff, they don't give therapeutic codes. It would have to be asked for, but as I said, the situation such as that, where the only difference for the 505(b)(2) NDA, the reason it was a 505(b)(2) NDA is because of a change in the excipient or something that wouldn't allow it to be an ANDA because of excipient. In that situation, I think would be one of the more likely cases where it may be possible to get an AB rating for that 505(b)(2) NDA.
Okay. All right. Well, again, I'd like to tell everyone that we have quite a number of questions still left. I think we're pretty much out of time, but we'll answer all of these questions and get those to you as soon as possible. The slides will be sent to you as well. I would just like to urge everyone to complete the survey that you have now in front of you. I'd like to thank Nick, Dr. Fleischer, for this very informative webinar, and also to everyone here who's tuned in for this webinar today. I would also like to extend to everyone to have a really wonderful holiday season and a happy and healthy new year, and that's all for today. So thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you or hear from you for the next webinar. Thank you.